We're gonna go live on Facebook. And we have somebody jumping in. Barb, one of our regulars, is here, which is great. And
Nice to meet you.
then- Excellent. Hi, Barb. All right. So with no further ado, welcome to Building Better Stories. This is part 2 of our 2-part series this July on Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn and Percival Everett's James. And we have a surprise, amazing special guest. So Professor Shelley Fisher Fishkin, who is a professor of English at Stanford University, but more importantly, she is author of this book that was recommended to me by, I think, Barb, you actually recommended it to me. I'm not really sure if it was you, but I think it was. And so we have, where I had the image of it and it's gone, but so
It up.
Professor Fishkin's book is called Jim, The Life and Afterlives of, remind me of the rest of that?
Huckleberry Finn's Comrade.
That's what I thought. So, with no further ado, Professor Fishkin, would you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn?
Well,
And here's Professor Hughes.
Hello, hello.
hi, nice to meet you. It actually began with Jim, and that's part of why I felt I really had to write this book when I had the opportunity to do so. I was a junior in high school, and I knew we were going to read Huck Finn, and I figured I knew what was coming. I'd read Tom Sawyer, and the title page said he was Tom Sawyer's comrade. And then the teacher handed out the assignment, which was write a paper on how Twain used irony to attack racism in Huck Finn. I
A
had
nice, easy entry.
Right. And I had never been asked to write a paper that was that interesting. And it was so challenging and so interesting that that's what propelled me into literature and eventually American studies. And the rest is history. I mean, I've spent a lot of time thinking about these questions, thinking about Twain. I've done other things too and written on other topics. But this particular interest really began with Jim, with being struck by how wild it was that a society would treat who was the man who was clearly the most admirable person in the book as someone who had the same rights as his mistress's cows and chickens. And the fact that Twain did not have any character in the book object to the status quo per se, challenge it, was really risky and really interesting and very daring. And that really got me thinking both about irony and also about the history that it was embodying and reflecting.
Wonderful. Okay. And so that in high school got you working on Huck Finn and irony and Mark Twain. And once you get involved in irony and Mark Twain, that leads directly to a PhD in English and such things, right?
Well, it kind of did. And I've been having adventures ever since.
That's fantastic. So we invited you. We have you for a little bit amount of time. I was blown away as I read your book that you said you were working on that book at the same time as James Percival Everett's book came out, which is pretty interesting confluence. So you raised a really interesting idea that I thought I hadn't seen before, but it makes perfect sense. And obviously, it's not only you, it's many scholars that this near the end of the book, which near the end of Huckleberry Finn, is a whole part of the book that many people sort of discount. They say it's farcical, it's uninteresting in any number of ways, but it's this, Jim is in captivity, and Tom Sawyer arrives, and they participate in this crazy campaign to free Jim from captivity, which most people, as I said, for a long time dismissed. However, there are a whole bunch of scholars who look at Tom Sawyer's idea, which is to keep Jim captive, to make it sort of this appropriate adventure story escape, right? That we're going to keep that in order to have um, a real official, right, appropriate narrative literary escape. Jim has to stay in captivity for a long time, and it has to be very elaborate in this whole deal. But you point out, as a lot of other scholars do, that this is something like freedom deferred
Mhm.
or freedom delayed, and that obviously we have, and that Twain is writing this not from, the 1860s or from the time period it's set, the 1830s or 1840s, but from the 1880s, already post end of Reconstruction, already in the midst of the quote unquote redemption, already in a time where it seems like freedom is actually not. And we see in Dr. King's writings 70 and 80 years later, the same understand, how much longer do we have to wait to be free? uh, which is so, part of the heartbreak of American history, which is that we don't do what we say. Uh, and so, what do you think about this, all of this now in light of our current uh, awful situation, which we might facetiously call the second redemption, uh, occur, as led by our current administration, the Supreme Court, and sort of a zeitgeist. Are we back to asking African Americans to wait for equality, or have we as a culture abandoned equality altogether in favor of a return to the conditions of the antebellum South? Are we happy with the norm of imposing slavery on everyone?
Well, I think I'm glad you brought this up because I think it's really important to keep in mind what happened, during the time that this book was written and when it was published. And yes, I think there are chilling resonances today, but I hope, my answer to both of those questions is going to be no, that we don't have to ask African Americans to wait, and we also, and the first part of it was. Do we just abandon the idea of equality? So, Twain starts the book writing it in 1876, which is the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. And he doesn't know yet when he starts it that he's going to write a book in which freedom will be a key theme. But I think, the fact that freedom was in the air at that moment may have helped set the book in the direction that it quickly began to go. But then, as he saw things happening in the summer, he saw election-related violence happening. He shelved it. He couldn't write anymore. He just wrote, he wrote a certain number of chapters, I think 15 or something. I forget exactly the number. And he put it down, and then he begins to see what's happening during the breakdown of Reconstruction. He also goes south himself to do research for Life on the Mississippi, and he sees the conditions himself. And what he's seeing is the convict lease system and sharecropping. And he's very aware of newspaper reports of lynchings. In fact, at one point, he plans to write a book about it. And he really recognizes the evisceration of Black rights that had been granted to the freed slaves. And he, I think, really has that in mind in the last portion of Huck Finn, because it is a story about setting a free Black man free. Why
Mm.
does, Jim have to go through all of this when he's already free? Well, why did the former slaves have to go through, 80 years of fighting for voting rights when they'd been granted voting rights? There had been actually a lot of Black participation in elections during Reconstruction. And it was a time when equality looked like it might actually be within sight. But then, as soon as Reconstruction was gone with the election of 1876, the Compromise of 1877, the former Confederates went back in power, and there were almost no Black voters in regions where there had been huge numbers. They just literally took away the rights. Also, the Supreme Court entered into the game by taking away the civil rights amendments, knocking down as unconstitutional the civil rights amendments. And I think it was in 1882, the same year that Twain returns to the book. So Tom Sawyer says at one point there that, hey, if we do this right, we could keep this going for about 80 years. And in fact, it does keep going for about 80 years. So I think that America didn't have a solution to the problem then, and we don't have a solution now. Du Bois, I think, had the most succinct summary of what was going on. He said the slave went free, stood a few brief moments in the sun, and then went back again to slavery. And that's what happens in the last portion of Huck Finn. So I think it's actually a brilliant way to get people to think about what was going on when Twain was writing the book. When I raised this idea back in 1985 for the first time, and I was unaware of anyone else who had, I think there were one or two scholars who had, but I wasn't aware of it. I was shot down by a Twain scholar who said, no, that's preposterous. But now, as you say, a number of scholars have jumped on that to that idea, and it doesn't seem preposterous at all. It's chillingly like what's happening now, and we can't accept that quietly, and we have to resist it, and we have to fight it, and we have to do everything we can to make sure that we're not retreating from equality. I mean, at the current moment, we are. At the current moment, the notion, in fact, J.D. Vance has even said that, well, we can't really be a creedal nation. We can't be a nation united by sharing a belief in the ideas in the Declaration of Independence. That doesn't make sense. We really are, a white nation descended from Anglo-Saxon settlers, and that's who we are. Well, that's not who we are. And
Very, very much not who we are.
yeah.
So that's for sure. Pastor Hughes, did you have a question before we moved on? Because, you just showed up.
I'm just absorbing everything. Listening to a scholar give us a class. Thank you.
Lynette, did you have something to say?
Oh, I have so much to say, but I don't think you should start because I would take up too much air in the room. Thank you,
I want to hear what you
Professor
have to
Fishkin,
say.
because there are all kinds of flashing lights going on in my head. Because of, again, is this 1880 or 2025? And
Yeah.
all of the things that you just shared that are so, I'm in the middle of reading like 3 different books. Another one happens to be Kindred by Octavia Butler. Some real,
Gotta talk.
all right, we gotta talk. And then we, in the Flourish Collective, my nonprofit, we will be reading the new Jim Crow. So that's a longer cohort.
Yeah.
So there are so many connections with what you're saying, but and what you've shared and I can't wait to read your book as well. But I need to stop talking because I'll just keep going.
Oh,
So
no.
I have a question. One of the things that Pastor Hughes has introduced into his community is a Juneteenth celebration, which you've never seen a whiter Juneteenth celebration than Pastor Hughes, Orchard Park Presbyterian Church. It's quite astounding. It seems like that moment when Tom Sawyer knows that Jim is free and Jim doesn't and is forced to wait. It seems like the setup for Juneteenth, that is the enslaved people in Texas who have not heard about the Emancipation Proclamation for what turns out to be years. And then it shows up at that, in June of what, 1865, right? Almost 2 years after the and Jim is in the same state of limbo, held hostage but not only by virtue of being recaptured, but also by a white boy who won't tell him he's free.
Even though he's free in his own mind.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
the thing about James and I just he in his mind. And so
Sorry, I lost what you just said. Could you repeat that, please? It didn't come through.
he's moving the mic there.
Thank you.
Can you hear him now? Go
No,
for it.
I was saying, let me pause it. I was saying that one of the things that struck me about James, the book itself, was how Jim was portrayed. And in his mind, he was already free. And it was a cognitive dissonant experience with Huck. And, while Huck was wrestling with the right thing and the wrong thing to do, Jim was like, well, I don't know about you, but I'm already there. But I'm going to keep this to myself because it's probably going to get me killed.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
And so that was such a visceral thing for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's already there.
Yeah, he's there.
He's already educated.
Yeah, he's literate. Yeah.
And having to dial that back on a
Yeah.
regular basis.
Dumb it down.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And training the next generation
Right.
to do so as well in order to survive.
To survive.
Yeah.
Well, and this has been an underlying question for us, and I think it's really at the heart of a lot of what's going on, even in the superstructure right now. This is
Twitter, YouTube.
we're getting our message from the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. Uh, so public education uh, is not a white nationalist American project. Public education is supported in this country by women and minorities at at the resistance and I had this insight in rereading Huck Finn because of course it's Huck's father who decries education and is actually getting in the way of American masculinity. And then here, and fast forward to James and Percival Everett's depiction, where it's so clear that Jim and Huck are at different levels of not just consciousness, but having been well read so that by the time we get to the end of James, the judge's problem with being held hostage by James is not that he's got a gun,
Right.
but that he reads.
Yes. He's smart.
Knowledge is power.
And probably smarter than the judge, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's really powerful about the book. One thing that I think, people might not realize is that there's a lot more that James and Jim have in common than not. Even though Jim is not literate and doesn't carry on conversations with Montaigne when he's when he's hallucinating. Um, Jim is really smart, and that's something that people really need to remember when they're reading the book, because there's just the assumption that because he's illiterate, he must not be intelligent. And Twain didn't buy that. In
Mm.
fact, even, some of the every exchange in the book that's been called, some one in which Jim shows himself to be a minstrel show stereotype, in fact, is showing his intelligence instead, and is showing his really deep insight into matters that Huck has no clue about. So, for example, the Solomon debate,
Mm.
which Jim, initially it looks like, well, he doesn't get it. He thinks he's really going to cut the child in half. No, what Jim is doing is he's using that as an occasion to challenge the arbitrary authority of the slaveholder who can separate families at will and in effect cut children in half. And Huck, it never occurs to Huck. He just that, the illegitimacy of slavery is not an idea that Huck entertains in the abstract or generalized way. Or the conversation about the Frenchman, does a Frenchman talk like a man? Well, on the one hand, Jim doesn't know that there are different languages, but on the other hand, he is asserting the common humanity of all men. He knows he is a man. He knows he communicates. He knows every man can. And that's something Huck never gets his head around either. So I think, one of the reasons I really wanted to, drill down on the ways in which Jim's intelligence shines through is because it usually just gets dismissed. Um, but I think, and the other thing that I thought was important to show is that, people are often skeptical that Twain, as an upper middle class white man, uh, at this moment in history, could write a black character who is really smart and who is really creative and who's really feeling. Because, Jefferson inscribed the stereotypes and myths about black people, in the 18th century, that they were not intelligent, not creative, that they were relatively insensible to pain. Well, Twain was imbued with that, just as everyone in the 19th century was throughout his childhood. And those beliefs lasted well into the 20th century. But Twain had the opportunity to get to know many individuals who disabused him of those myths. He knew some very, very smart black people very well.
So this leads to really another question that you and I sort of began to talk about, which is the power of persuasion. That Mark Twain shifts his perspectives over time, and you trace it so beautifully in the first part of the book, talking about where he started and where he ends up, and even as you say, where he started Huck Finn in the early 1870s and where he actually picked it up again in the 1880s. So do you believe that studying Huckleberry Finn constitutes a good way of persuading people about the America that Twain seemed to hope for? Is Huckleberry Finn still a good vehicle for that?
I really think it's a terrific vehicle for that, because I think that you can't buy into the pulling the rug out from equality and civil rights and all that goes with that unless you dehumanize the people who will be affected by that move. And one thing that fiction does, one thing that a book like Huck Finn and a book like James can do is get you inside the head and the heart
Mm.
of people who you might not see that way. And it's impossible to view Jim as someone who somehow, should be enslaved because he's limited and that's all that he really deserves to do in life. It's impossible when you read that book. And so I think that literature is a way of dealing with these issues at one remove from
Mhm.
contemporary politics, but it can be extremely helpful. At least I hope it is. I know that it was, galvanizing for me, and I know a number of other people for whom it was. And it also is a book that gets a lot of people wanting to be writers themselves, black and white. Ralph Ellison, I had the privilege of interviewing Ralph Ellison in the 90s, and
Wow.
and he said that Huck Finn was a book that helped all of us find our own voices. That Twain's efforts to portray Jim speaking the language that he spoke helped give Ellison the courage to do the same. And so I don't want to deprive young people of that. I think it's too important an opportunity for them to learn.
Yeah, you can see Mark Twain's influence on Ellison if you read Native Son.
Mhm.
I don't know if you ever read Native Son. Yeah.
It's Richard Wright. Yeah.
Yeah, Richard Wright, sorry. I see the similarities there, but just
Yeah.
that was just a pop in my brain. But to answer your
Invisible.
question, um, Rabbi, about is this book, is it a good place to start? Yes, it is. That's why it's being banned. Did you? I didn't know this until today, that there are schools in Florida and in Texas that are banning Huckleberry Finn.
Again, because
Again,
right, because of course, it was banned in the 1880s when it came out.
And now it's being banned again.
So, Professor Fishkin, this is a question that occurs to me in the way I'm reading Jill Lepore's These Truths. She wrote A New History of the United States, and she starts in 1492. Uh, and one of the things that Columbus does that no other explorer had done before him is claim lands in the name of that are obviously occupied as Spain's, right? These are now ours, and we're ignoring these people. And the word she uses is that he judges people based on literacy, that it is a literal power. That is the power of being able to read and write. That allows Columbus in her presentation to dismiss as not, and there's a whole history afterwards of dismissing indigenous people and the people that are found for all sorts of reasons, right? Eventually, we have John Locke saying that the um, indigenous Americans have no rights because they don't cultivate land. Uh, and so, but this literacy edge, as it were, and and then now with what Pastor Hughes just said, here we are facing an anti-literate country
Mhm.
yet again, where there are all sorts of strata of literacies now, and they are being warded over different segments of the population by. Uh, can you? Is there a way, maybe, where we can bring Huck Finn back and into this forward-thinking idea? Not just for high school students, but how do we do that? What are you finding in discussions with college students who are coming needing to with this idea that Huck Finn is going to make them uncomfortable and they shouldn't be uncomfortable in college classes? How are you coping with that?
Well, first of all, I should say that I have on every syllabus I have a line that says something to the effect of, we don't want you to be traumatized by anything that happens in this classroom, but if you're uncomfortable, that's part of the plan because being made uncomfortable is part of education and it is by being uncomfortable and encountering ideas you may not have encountered before that you learn. So I make it very clear that, that there's a difference between being really seriously hurt and feeling uncomfortable. But I think that it's interesting that while, there are efforts from the right now to ban the teaching of Black history in classrooms, especially in Florida, this is true right now. When Huck Finn is challenged, that it tends to not be from the right. I hope that it'll stay that way. It tends to be from progressives who are afraid that it will make Black children feel bad about themselves. And the reason for that is a basic, well, two things. One is the presence of the N-word in the book, and that's something that can't be avoided, and you can't avoid it by teaching a bowdlerized version, but you have to come up with strategies for teaching it. And so you have to actually start teaching the history of the word and show, share materials with students that help them understand it. And also, I believe you should have a rule about not saying it. But you do read it because I think it honors, Twain's text by keeping the words that he wrote in front of students. Um, but you have to make it very clear that it's still a very potent word, and it's potent because the racism that it reflects is still there. And by the way, this is a story that you may know about, but if you don't, it takes place in Buffalo, and so you have to share it with everybody you know, which is that how do we know that Twain understood the negative power of this word? Well, he wrote a remarkable satire, his first satire on racism towards African Americans, in the Buffalo Express in
Hmm.
1869.
Wow.
It's a piece titled Only an N-word, but he doesn't call it N-word.
Mhm.
And it's a satire about a lynching in Memphis in which he gets inside the head of the lynchers who justify it by saying that, well, they've just lynched an innocent Black man. And they say, well, when Southern honor is at stake, what difference does it make? I mean, we really have to do this. And he literally gets inside their heads the way he's going to get inside Pap Finn's head. And and their rationale is, why should we really worry if only an innocent N-word is killed in the process? Well, the whole piece is about the way in which that word others people and the way in which that word allows lynchers to hide behind it and pretend that the person isn't human. So Twain knew that it was a painful word. So that's a problem. I think you teach that piece before they read Huck Finn and they understand that Twain gets it and that he's not using it casually, but he's also using the word that would have been spoken at the time. But then the problem is that our assumptions, or a lot of assumptions that people bring to the book in society today, are similar to the ones that were around in Twain's day, which is that somebody who's illiterate can't be smart,
Mm.
and that maybe Black people don't feel the same pain as white people do, and maybe they can't be creative. Well, you have to address the ways in which Twain breaks down all of those myths. Now, Huck never gets beyond some of them. So he does learn that Jim is smart. Jim constantly beats him in arguments, so he gets to that one. And he does learn that Jim is just feels pain and grief just as much as white people do. And he, hears Jim grieving over being separated from his children and remembering how he treated his daughter. He never gets around the idea that Jim is actually a creative storyteller. Jefferson said, he'd never met a Black person who could say anything above the level of clear narration. Well, that's kind of what Huck thinks. And when Jim tells the story about, being chased by witches and given a nickel by the devil himself, Huck and a lot of readers just assume that, well, he's just a superstitious darky. But in fact, it's very clear, and and I go into this in some detail in the book. He's seen the boys when they're playing the trick on him. He knows they're there. I mean, if you hear a sound in the dark and you don't know who made it, you're gonna sit there and listen quietly. You're not gonna say, I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna sit here until I hear it again. And that's what you do if you're humoring some children who are hiding behind your skirts and you say, I don't know where that little girl is, but I'm going to look for her till I find her. So he's humoring these children. He's seen them, he's playing with them. And then he has this problem. He has a nickel. He's happy to have the nickel, but how does he justify having a nickel? A slave with a nickel isn't normal. By the way, nickels weren't invented yet, so it's an anachronism. Um, but, uh, but he comes up with a great plan. He comes up with this wild story about witches and devils and chases. And people come from all other farms around there and they pay him to tell it. And he gets out of work. And he's in effect become someone who's paid to tell a story, like Twain. He's created himself as an author because he's very creative. So I think, people who are challenging the book because it will make, Black students feel bad about themselves just aren't teaching it the right way. And it's a very hard book to teach, and you have to be prepared to teach it. By the way, I did an NEH seminar some years ago that's on my website. The website for the book, by the way, it's really easy to remember. It's just my name. It's shelleyfisherfishkin.com.
Yeah, I actually have it up, so I will put it in the chat for
If
everybody.
you know anyone who's trying to teach the book, there's a link on the video and podcast page to the NEH seminar, which I did with high school teachers a few years ago, and that has strategies and it talks about this piece and other pieces. But it's a hard book to teach, and not everyone should teach it. They shouldn't teach it if they're not prepared to. But if they are prepared to teach it, they should be able to convey how admirable Jim is and how remarkable a character he is. And instead of, making students feel bad about themselves, it should make them feel terrific. That's why, in order to kind of show that this was possible, I made my final chapter focus on two high school classrooms where the teachers figured out how to teach the book. And the
Mm.
comments that their students made, and I have pictures of actually I have pictures of a lot of the students in the book. Seven of them, are pictured singly and others in a group. These particular students are in New Jersey. Um, they, they got it. They said their comments were more astute than those of many of the critics. So it's definitely possible to do. I'm going to have to go to another
Yes.
meeting, I'm afraid, but I want to thank you for inviting me. And I think, your questions were just so good, and I
Oh,
really enjoyed it. And I wish I could hear from you a little more. I just, is there anything finally that you would like to say any of you would like to say before I have to take off?
anyone?
I just appreciate just meeting you, Dr. Professor Fishkin, and I will certainly will explore your book. And just a quick note about the incredible power of language, and we'll talk more about that. But just the through line of the impact of language and the importance of language and literacy in the life of James, and as carried forward from then till now, when as a Black person. It's unnerving for some white people when they meet me in person and they have a perception of me that they have because they've known me on the phone or something. And they are dismantled by the lack of belief that I'm the same person
Mm.
because
Mm.
of whatever their perception is of me
Mm.
when they see me and put my language together and my communication. So that's a huge part of what I took away of this theme throughout
Thank you, Lynette.
James. Yeah.
No, honestly, Professor Fishkin, it's such an honor that I so appreciate you for responding and joining us. And we will definitely figure out a way to continue this conversation in different formats. And so thank you. And maybe we'll just all come and take a class with you at Stanford.
All right. That would be great. Thank you for inviting me. Really appreciate
Please.
it. Nice to meet you, all of you. Bye-bye.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. You too.
So that was an unexpected and awesome surprise. So literally, I sent a note via Facebook direct message to her yesterday and said, "Hey, we're doing this." And it turns out that so I had written an article that had in part in response to a lot of the stuff that she wrote about Mark Twain as a growing person and how important persuasion is. Because I feel like we're in a persuasion crisis.
Mm.
And for both sides, right? I feel like that the Ibram Kendi, Robert DiAngelo, calling us out on our need to be anti-racist has also shut the door on the idea that persuasion is possible. So that we just have to we have to circle the wagons with those who are with us and pass laws and policies to make things better without bringing people along. Because he really, Abramex Kenny really does, understandably, sort of scholastically, in a scholarly way, dismantle persuasion as effective. But Twain serves as this counterpoint, and especially in Professor Fishkin. So I wrote this piece about persuasion. Turns out because I footnoted her, she got a Google alert about it even before I reached out to her.
You reached out? Wow, that's crazy.
So,
She's on top of it.
She is.
So all of this leads us to James, because I think really where we ended with Professor Fishkin on this question, and where you did on literacy, and the story arc of James is different than the story arc of Huckleberry Finn. And I wonder, really asking the two of you and Barb too, what do you think of its effectiveness as sort of a Huckleberry Finn partner? I mean, we because we had Professor Fishkin today, we had to focus on Huck Finn. But I giving James voice is so powerful, and so powerful for what you just expressed, because of course, I personally know the power of sounding like a white guy on the phone.
Yes.
And I've used it to my advantage. James literally introduces the broader white world to code switching.
Yes.
And says that that Jim was doing it all along. So what do the two of you have to say about that? I mean, I can only imagine, because
Ladies first.
Wow.
I got a lot to say about it.
I do too, but so what an incredible concept that, this fresh look at James. And I don't know if I can to either of you, my husband, whose name is James, but in our former life, in our life in California, was Jim. And then when we moved back to New York, he became James as a really deliberate thing on his part. So this is so very interesting to see that that transformation, but it wasn't a transformation because this is who James was the whole time, meaning James in in his book. And so being able to be on the outside looking into the life of this Black man enslaved who was freed, and then having to assume some of the roles that that were thrust upon him because of his social situation with regard to our history and what was happening to Black people at that time, and seeing I can't imagine, and I kept thinking about the complete frustration of living, code switching in his life, not just his language, but having to live in two worlds at the same time, and then teach again his children to do the same thing in order to survive and make them happy. And so, again, the parallels between that experience and what I see and perceive happening now, the fact that, Dr. Fishkin mentioned Vance and his saying, we can't be a country with a creed. Well, why do people want the 10 Commandments,
Right.
to be in just, in classrooms everywhere and adhere to? That makes, that's absolute hypocrisy. But again, having, being able to see a fresh look at where we are, at what's happening in our current history, and what this is kind of like a new manual for like, oh, this is how we work our way. This is how we find our way, as you were saying, with regard to what tactics do we use now because of this reoccurrence of all of this between 1880 and 2025. What is it? And there's a lot in this book that, it's kind of like that, oh, okay, this is insightful. And this exposes, because so much of James's experience exposes the weaknesses of, the white majority controlling, culture. So that's kind of my heads.
Mhm.
But you,
But I like the idea of James because it gives James humanity
Mhm.
more so than what he gets in Huck Finn. I understand why, because Jim is not necessarily the center of the story in Huck Finn. So I get that he's more of a secondary character. I mean, an important character, but kind of secondary. And so
I mean, I'm going to channel, I think, Professor Fishkin at this point and say no. That say, in fact, that Jim is in fact um, in a subterranean way, in a subtle way, the protagonist in Huck.
I mean, okay, I'm not going to argue that. I'm not going to argue that. But what I'm saying is the way he is portrayed in the book, the way he's portrayed in Huck Finn is a very stripped down, almost a caricature of an actual person. Whereas in James, he's an actual human being. He's complex,
yes.
right? He's not just a slave waiting to be saved. He is active in his own liberation. He's surviving. The code switching is just one of the aspects of that survival that most people don't understand. Black people understand it all too well. I'm not gonna say I was surprised, or I'm not gonna say that I was shocked, but it was interesting to read and then to understand, oh wait, we do that now. And put that back into its historical context. It reminds me of a story. I'll tell it and then I'm done. So it was a story that I because I'm a jazz musician. I went to college for music, and my jazz teacher was telling us a story about Louis Armstrong. He was on tour. We're talking about Louis Armstrong at his height. He was still young-ish. He had already recorded some records. He had been around the world as a top musician. Carnegie Hall. He had sold out all these places. This is Louis Armstrong, and he's on another tour, and he's driving with his manager down this back road somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and they get lost or the car breaks down or something to that effect. And when they go, when the locals go up to the car, they see this black man in the back seat because he's the star, and the manager and everyone's in the front seat. They're about to beat up the white guys. Why you got this N-word in the back seat? And they promptly and then immediately this well-educated, because Louis Armstrong was well-educated, right? Grew up a Jewish family, by the way. Did you know that?
No.
Yes, Louis Armstrong was raised in a Jewish household. So, not that that's why he's educated, but anyway, so
It's a good way,
yeah,
but it's not 100%.
but it's not 100%. And so he took on the persona of what they expected a Negro to be at that time, at that place. He started looking down. Oh, sir, I'm so sorry. And that satisfied these locals, and they allowed them to pass. He got out, got in the front, and proceeded to drive them off. He was able to put himself in his place so that he could survive. Because they were going to kill them, all of them.
Right.
Right.
But the code switching as a survival skill, right?
Mhm.
Ta-Nehisi Coates does that in, Between the World and Me, and
Yes.
letter to his son.
Yes,
He
he does.
basically expresses, and this is only 20 years ago when he
Yeah.
wrote that.
Yeah.
How important code switching is
Mhm.
as a survival skill in the 21st century
Mhm.
for African American young men.
Mhm.
I mean, again, the shocking, the J.D. Vance quote, the shocking nature of the place that we're in today, and how not so far from the 1880s we are.
Yeah.
But James is transported in some way on this thing. To a certain extent, I wonder if Percival Everett gives us a strategy for bringing forward James's code switching into our conversations today, right? Because part of the challenge is, how do you point out to the white woman that their house is on fire?
Yes.
Yes.
answer to that question, and I don't know if Percival Everett read this, but I see a lot of Zora Neale Hurston's work in this book.
How so?
Because Zora Neale Hurston was one of the first authors, black or white, or anyone who dared to write literature in the vernacular of the people.
Right.
Yeah.
And so language is power, right? Language is power. And that was the power of Zora Neale Hurston, was that she presented it as it's given. All right. I'm going to tell the story exactly the way it's been told to me. You know, passing down this dialect so that as a form of resistance. And so I see a lot of that in James, how he uses the dialect. Now, some of it, you know, it's anachronistic, all right? So it's not completely, having read Zora Neale Hurston a lot and hearing, okay, it's a little bit wonky, but the idea that he's using James's voice as James's voice is in itself an act of resistance. To say that this is a valid form of communication, I think that's what.
So I'm actually asking a different question. I'm wondering if in fact the model of him instructing the young people
Mm,
of how to tell a white woman that her house is on fire, how to advise a white woman how to put out an oil fire, a grease fire, is something that we need to incorporate into our dialogue facilitation today.
To make it palatable, right? To make it acceptable to white people, whatever the it happens to be, whether it's the grease fire or your house is on fire. You know, I think that's first of all a super intriguing question.
that's a very good question.
And you know, I think that that, as I was sort of referring to earlier, that kind of like operating manual, that strategy to make, again, those whom we're referring to who are part of white majority culture, who don't want equality today, who don't, you know, accept the fact that Black history is American history, all those things, right? That's a super insightful way to work our way around this and to bring that palatable, acceptable. This was my idea, right? This was, I thought of this whole idea of, and hopefully getting there to where they will say, okay, yeah, this is good for all of us, isn't it? You know,
Well, the house is on
and,
fire.
yeah, and listening to Ibrahim Skinty talking about the fact that we have all been robbed by this. We have all been robbed of, you know, of our full humanity because of the inability or the refusal to see each of us as fully human, especially those of us whose ancestors were brought here enslaved, and share the history that we share. So I'm, you know, at this point in the game, I'm like, okay, I'm down for this. I wanna figure this out and have us write that book and say, this is here's the inroad. Here's a few weeks, I should say, a few weeks ago, my 28-year-old Black son was having a conversation with us and with myself and my husband. And he's talking about, he lives in Orlando, which is in Florida, and he works at Universal Studios and he's a supervisor there. And so he's very much a people person. And one of the things that he said in a moment, you know, sometimes we have moments of, wow, have we done okay as parents? And when he said to us, with regard to some of the issues that he's dealing with at work, you know, dealing with people, you know, being, you know, supervising people as a 28-year-old, 6'2" Black man. He said, Mom and Dad, I need you to know how much I appreciate the fact that you helped me learn to navigate this white. And we were just like, I cried because it was just like this moment of code switches. I can't keep up with him. I can't keep up with him in the way that he code switches.
We have a very interesting story, I think, because how old is Noni?
8.
Right. So parent of an 8-year-old African/African American girl,
Yes.
parent of an 18-year-old white Jewish young man,
Yes.
parent of a 28-year-old African American young man. We have 3 decades worth of children between the three of us. And I think this is going to be a very interesting story to find out because our son is going to UVM, University of Vermont,
Yes.
and which has an incredibly terrible history over the last 10 years of anti-Semitism.
Some of that history, yes.
So it's gotten better, but we'll see. And he also is the code switching from our household is different. And the need to be able to navigate between different worlds is different. And obviously the question of how much of a survival skill it is different.
I agree. I think it has changed over the years.
Yes.
When I was growing up, my mother taught me how to navigate the white man's world. And one of the things that she harped on was appearance. Appearance and speech.
Oh, yes.
How you look and how you talk.
Yes.
Okay. And I would ask her, Mom, why do you keep correcting me? Why do you keep correcting me? And she would say, because if you do not speak correct English, they respect you. That's the one easiest way for them not to respect you, is if you don't know how to speak correct English. And she would pound this into my brain. And then the other one was appearance. So I went through a phase where I wore baggy jeans and Timberland boots and, throwback jerseys and the hats and all that, because I was really into New York culture back then. I was hip hop, Wu-Tang Clan. And my mom kept saying,
and you were in Atlanta.
And I was in Atlanta. Right? I had cornrows. I was thugging it out. My mom would say, you're never going to get a job dressed. I wanted to grow dreads. You're not going to get a job. Not going to get hired. You're not gonna. And she kept pounding this into me. And for what it's worth, she was right. Because as soon as I cleaned up a little bit, things opened up to me. But now it's different. Everybody's wearing dreads now. And now these things are more accepted. There's still some areas where they're not.
Right.
But it's more accepted than my generation. And so I'm worried because I'm not able to keep up with this code switch.
Yeah. Because
it's a different ballgame now.
Yes.
Right now, common vernacular is more acceptable. AAVE, which I don't agree with the term, but it's become more acceptable now, which I think is also to our detriment because now everyone can speak it. Right?
Yes.
And it's weird. And I'm terrified, but I'm grateful because I've had this opportunity to teach my children, but I don't know what I'm going to do because it's different. But I can't tell my son wants to grow dreads. I can't say, don't grow dreads. They won't take you seriously because of course they will. So what's the next thing, right? What's the next thing? Can't rub your skin off. So what do they do?
Well,
right?
and what a horrific whiplash.
Yeah.
Right. Because, you shared with me the challenge of the code switching of passing your Presbyterian final exam.
Yeah.
In Presbyterian seminary,
Yeah.
where, Pastor Hughes knew the answers, but wrote the answers in what he thought was plain English, but it wasn't in Presbyterian idiom.
Wow.
So therefore, it wasn't correct.
So I took me 3 times to pass ordination exams. And it wasn't until an older white guy, pastor, sat me down, he was a mentor of mine, and he said, oh, he read all of my responses. He said, oh, so you do know the material. Yeah, man, I'm not stupid. And they said, oh, I see. When you say this, instead say, and when they talk about these kinds of things, what they're referring to is this. And so that's how you answer. You have to know the answers to the test.
Speak their language.
You have to speak their language. Oh my God, it blew my mind. So then last time I took the exams, it was a breeze because I figured out that they were looking for certain buzzwords or looking for certain idioms, right? Which helped me pass the exams, but then I had to do an in-person, I had to sit before a board, a panel of my peers,
Soon to be peers,
who I'd never seen before. They'd never seen me before. And the questions that they asked me were borderline offensive. The question that they asked me, because you could tell right off the bat that they they were questioning whether or not I was smart enough to be a Presbyterian, to be a pastor in a Presbyterian congregation.
They were impressed by how articulate
They
you
were impressed by how articulate I was. They were impressed that I took the test 3 times. So one of the first questions they asked me was, they said, what made you take the test again? And I said, well, you take it till you pass. I'm not the only one who's failed the exam. Most people fail it the first time, right? They expect that. Only the nerds and the geeks take the pass on the first. It's like the bar, right? You take the bar, you fail. Oh, I'll do it again, till you pass. So it wasn't like I was the only one to fail, but they asked me, what made you take it again? And I'm thinking, well, everybody takes it again, right? Well, yeah, but you particularly, and I was like, me particularly what? I couldn't understand. Again, I didn't understand the idiom.
Yeah.
And so once I learned the code switch, everything clicked. I said all the right things that I was supposed to say. I sounded like a Presbyterian, and they were satisfied. That's all it took. It took me a minute, though. I'm slow, but it took me a minute.
So the end of James is very different from the end of Huckleberry Finn. And James needs to code switch back to convince a bunch of other enslaved people
Yeah.
to break free at the end of
Yes, I was reading that just now. Go ahead. You got it.
And I confess that I did not read the very end of the book. Go.
Oh, man.
I apologize for this.
Oh, spoilers. Spoiler alert.
You're not.
So
Yes.
So at the end of Huckleberry Finn is, a storybook ending,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
At the end, Tom reveals that Jim is in fact free, and they all go back and live, and it all works out.
Yes.
That episode doesn't happen in James.
Mhm.
And at the end of James leads in a story,
Mhm.
and he goes back to Hannibal.
Mhm.
Because he needs to find his wife and his children,
Right.
and he holds up the judge
Mm.
until the judge will give him a map and show him how to read it,
Right.
and show him where he needs to go. And then he goes to this what is a breeder plantation,
Mhm.
where his wife has been sold in order to have more children, because that's what they do on this plantation.
Mhm.
And he finds some shackled men, and he has to convince them
Yeah.
that he's not a crazy person.
Yeah.
He has to go back into an enslaved person vernacular in order to have bona fides.
Mhm.
And gain their confidence.
Strength.
Yeah. Persuasion. It's about the persuasion again,
Yeah.
right?
So it's a very different ending.
Mhm.
It's a resistance ending,
Mhm.
right? It's not a white savior ending,
Right.
because the Mark Twain offers us, for all intents and purposes, a white salvation ending.
Yeah.
Is this a helpful ending today?
James?
Yeah.
Hmm. Helpful. I don't know. I don't know about helpful, but I think it gives the story it feeds into the complexity of the character. I don't know about helpful to what or to whom.
Well, to us in a society where suddenly we're finding the question of what it means to resist.
Yeah. Not having read
Yeah.
the book, and now I'm reading
It's
what comes to mind are two things. Number one, solidarity, and number two, affinity. That he had to gain the trust of the enslaved people in order to be successful, right, in his exploit at the end, and what he was trying to attempt. And so when I think about that, and I think about where we are today, and the fact that there's a percentage of Black men that voted for Trump, there is a percentage of Latinos who voted for Trump, okay, and how everything that represents right now in our finding the resistance, right, and hopefully turning the trajectory of where we're going and where we are now in a different different direction, So those two things most definitely come to mind, the need to see reflected, in literature, and everywhere else possible, the idea of solidarity, the idea of, of affinity, of brotherhood, of, in order to not just survive, but to flourish, to thrive.
And the price that we pay for thriving.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I kind of get where you're coming from now, as far as it being helpful. I think it's helpful in the sense that it it accurately portrays the modern plight of African Americans in this country.
Yes.
Because it is all about solidarity, but solidarity with who?
Yes.
And how many people can you be solid with? Can't be solid with everybody. All your skin folk ain't your kinfolk, right? So
you just grabbed that right out of my head.
yeah. And I mean, and this is exactly what the ending portrays. It
Yes.
portrays like they don't trust him.
Yes.
What you do walking around here? He's supposed to be in chains like them. And he's saying, no, we're not supposed to be in chains at all.
Yes.
Right. So this is the struggle that we share even today. Hi. It calls to mind, have you ever heard of Charleston White?
Yes.
Okay, so you know the story of Charleston White. Charleston White was a social activist back in the 90s, late 90s, I think. He grew up in the hood. He turned himself around. He, put on a suit and a tie. He started organizing all of these mentor programs, and he was, social activist. He was teaching Black boys, and he was doing all these great and wonderful things, and nobody from the Black community paid him any mind. He got all this money from white people. He was in a room with senators and Congress people, and they were like, hey, we'll give you all this money because you're helping the community. But the community did not support it. As soon as Charleston White took off his three-piece suit, shaved his head, put on his bucket, right, baggy clothes, and started talking vernacular, all of a sudden he's popular. He's got a chain, he's got the rings, but he's still doing the same things, right? He's on all these podcasts, and he's using this vernacular. He's cursing and but he's saying the same thing. And now all of a sudden, he has a following among
He's
the
got
Black
clout.
community. He's got clout now.
Yeah.
Same stuff. And that's the struggle that we go through. And I go through it myself. I've been trying to talk to the kids in Buffalo public school system since I've been here. They don't really pay me any attention because number one, I'm coming from Orchard Park. Number two, I don't speak like them. And they think because I speak white, that I must be white.
Yes.
If they don't see the flag that I fly in front of my house, they don't know the books that I read, they don't know any of that. And so what do I have to do to to persuade them that I'm on their side, right? So
this is the solidarity question is a big one.
Yeah.
Because we're in a state of constant identifying why I shouldn't talk to that person.
Exactly.
So Barb, you haven't said anything, which is very unusual for you, but I wanted to give you the opportunity. And Leslie, welcome. Thank you for joining us. To say anything about James or anything else that's on your mind, because
I loved the book and I was planning on being here, and I am obviously an hour late. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. It's a pleasure that you're here, and we're honored that you're here at all.
Well,
Barb, did you have anything else to?
You may not like to hear what I have to say. I had a lot of things to say, but you excluded me. You said, I want to hear from the two of you, meaning the two academics, Reverend Hughes and the other person. If you remember, you did say that. And twice you made a reference to the two people that are here. And I was the third. So how do you expect to bridge gaps and communicate with people when you can't even do it in the Zoom?
Fair enough. I accept correction, Barb, and I apologize. So
Apology accepted.
100%. And
as far as Huck Finn, I mean, I read that first, and I read that as, I'm 75. I read that in middle school or something. So I reread that, and maybe it's a product of my age, but I saw the wisdom, the humanity, and all of those things in Jim, in Huck Finn. And
And
that's
that's why
great. We're out of time.
no, we're
So-
not out of time. It's why I've reserved this time to go to you, Barb. That is in fact Professor
And I
Fishkin's.
think, and I really resented the professor I didn't resent it. I just disagree with the word smart, because you can have a lot of smartness and still not be empathetic, insightful, and humane.
Absolutely.
And, I am probably the least educated person here. I mean, I had an associate's degree and went back to school to get my bachelor's when I was 58. And that's as far as I got.
Barb, I've never thought of you as anything but wise. So, first of all, I absolutely apologize. I did not mean to exclude you. And I'm interested very much so in, so I think Professor Fishkin's use of the word smart is in fact an argument with all of those people who identify Jim as a non-presence, right? She's in fact arguing on Jim's behalf against detractors over the last 150 years, right? So that, since Mark Twain put that book out, right, the first reviews identified Jim as N-word Jim, a name that he was never attached to him in the book. He was never called that in the book. It became something that was used. And you're the one who led me to this book, to Professor Fishkin's book. So for which I give you credit. So thank you.
It was Tay.
It was Tay, not you? I thought it was you.
No, I have the book, but no, it was Tay.
So my apologies to Tay, who's not here. I'll do a lot of apologizing. It's a good Jewish tradition. So, but I feel that we are often coming, and this is I think what Percival Everett identifies in James, that he moves us to, that Professor Fishkin also identifies, which is that so many people come to read something and we don't leave ourselves behind. Right? That what's powerful about a novel is entering into conversation with someone that we haven't met yet, for the exploration and adventure, for the fact that we are going to encounter something entirely new. And what early on, what Twain encountered in putting forward Huck Finn, and what I think Percival Everett demands us to see, is that there's something there, right? That, as you said, Barb, that Jim is deep and profound and empathetic and smart, and capable in so many ways, and he is the parent that Huck needed and didn't have. James Percival Everett goes so far as to have James then admit that he is in fact Huck's father, which is justifiable based on the text. So thank you for that, Barb. And no, we're not rushing to leave, because we've gathered and our group has grown. Any other thoughts?
I think
I
I
have
missed
one
a
more
really
thought.
good conversation. I'm really sorry.
Well, I will put it back out on YouTube and you can find it. Yes,
So,
Trust Hughes.
and I wanted to wait until today to say this. Last time we talked about, I sat over there. Last time we talked about this, you said that Huck Finn, you believe that Huck Finn was an anti-slavery book, right? Something to that effect. Am I correct?
Yeah, fair enough.
And I disagreed with you. And I gave my reasons. And at the time, I had just started reading James. I'd already read Huck Finn. I had just started reading James. And so once I finished James, I had to think about it some. And I see where you were coming from, saying that it was anti-slavery. because of the historical context, right? I'm thinking of anti-slavery in 2025, right? And I was totally ignorant to what anti-slavery meant in 18.
Downtown Central Library. Did you know they offer downloadable books and magazines?
I didn't know that.
Have streaming movies and music albums.
That's awesome.
Card. If you need a library card, or want information about library services, please see a staff member. Thank you so much for joining us today.
A word from our sponsor.
Word from our sponsor. And so I had to think about that. I had to think about the historical context. I had to think about also, you know, Percival is writing from somewhat his own experience. He's putting the African American experience and the history of it since then, he's putting that back into the character. And Mark Twain didn't have any of that.
Right.
He had none of that. So in a sense, yes, this was about as anti-slavery as you could get, considering the times. So I recant my disagreement, and I stand in agreement with you that it could be considered an anti-slavery.
I think it depends is a good answer.
Yeah, well,
Especially given the context, at the time.
Yeah.
That's huge.
yeah, it was huge. I mean, and I'm saying this because we can criticize Mark Twain in his portrayal of Jim, but then again, we're talking about back then, and he never met a slave or a former slave before.
Well, so actually, Twain had incredible experience both with enslaved people and
with
and freed African Americans.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Professor Fishkin points out in her book is all of the relationships he had throughout his life, because of course he grew up in Missouri when there was slavery, and but Frederick Douglass is a close friend of his.
Okay, well, that makes sense.
And then she recounts a number of key experiences with African Americans in his life that he recounts, right? So he's got a long history, which is where he gets. I mean, what's really interesting, and you mentioned Zora Neale Hurston really revolutionizing the way we, recount our stories authentically in the voices of the people who speak them. But Twain was attempting to do exactly that.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
He reported on a story told to him by an African American woman, word for word, and attempted to reproduce the dialect long before he wrote Huck Finn.
Right.
And then he, his proviso is that I'm really attempting to provide you 4 separate, Mississippi River area dialects in this, and
it's very revolutionary.
Right. Nobody did that before.
Yeah, I agree.
So, to the extent that somebody much more famous and wise than I did once said that, Mark Twain invented the American novel with this book. So, but I think the relevance that we are looking for, the code switching experience, Percival Everett taking the African American experience and retrojecting it into.
Retroject. I love it.
That's a good one.
It's a good
I
one.
like that.
Retroject.
He's giving us, right? We only get Huck Finn's internal voice. We don't have Jim as a protagonist. It was revolutionary enough to have Jim as a character.
Right.
But to give Jim an internal voice. So I'm interested in something that you raised as sort of our final question, as the Jim to James transformation. Because I also underwent a transformation. I went from John to Jonathan as a young adult.
Yes.
So I'm interested in, if you feel comfortable recounting it, why your husband did that.
Yes, I'm very comfortable sharing. Thanks for asking. James, it's funny because I used to call him Jim too, and now he's James. That's going to be part of my book. But the time that he lived in California, and up until that time, James was born and raised in Maryland, right outside DC. And So his mother especially, but then everybody else in his family called him Jimmy. So his family, you'll still hear some of his aunts calling him Jimmy.
Mhm.
And sometimes when I'm harassing him, I'll say Jimmy, like his mother used to do. And
Likes that.
so who he was in California and kind of his not being in full possession of himself as a Black man, and being participating in organizations within churches that were largely white dominated,
Mhm.
mostly white dominated, and not seeing himself fully, therefore, right? And so he says that I rescued him from that life. I'm like, okay, I'll take that. I'll take that. But then, being able to then move outside of that context and still be Jim until 1994, when we moved back to New York, to Southern New York, where we own our home. The discarding of Jim was also the discarding of his father. Because his father was Jim also. They had no imagination. There were 3 James Curtis Marshalls, and it was like, really, they couldn't think of any other names. So, and James's father was an abusive
Mhm.
person, to say, that's a long story. But so he was discarding that
Mhm.
and saying, no, that's not who I am. I'm James. My name is James, and and all of the Jameses before him were Jims. And
Mhm.
he's like, no, I'm James.
Wow.
And so, seeing him and seeing the evolution of his personality and his self-awareness, and, who he became as a community, a pillar of the community, and, a real stakeholder and so forth. It really, really made such sense that, in fact, my best friend's family were, when we were with them at one point, when they were living in Reno, we were visiting, and my best friend's sister said something to her husband about James, and so he said to James something like, "Hey Jim," something like that, blah blah blah, and James is like, "I'm James," and so it was about going to the gym. And so now they say to anybody that's going, they say, "Oh, are you going to the James?" So it's like all of that. But yes, it's quite, like I said, when I knew that you were reading James, I was like, oh, this definitely has to happen.
So thank you for that, because I think that's a really good sort of coda for our discussion, which is that we are in a constant state of growing and correcting and self-correcting, in my case, and the rewriting of our stories so that they continue to be relevant, so that they continue to be something that is a teaching story, and the rediscovering. And for me, it's hard to imagine reading James without reading Huck Finn first,
Mm.
as a pair. And but I obviously we're gonna, it's a best-selling Pulitzer Prize winning novel, so the likelihood is there are people who have encountered it and didn't bother reading Huck Finn at all, much less reading them together. So with all of that, thank you all so much. This is the next week we are meeting for an in-person gathering with a different pastor, because Pastor Hughes is going to be in Kenya already.
Mhm.
And so Tanya Spencer is going to, Pastor Tanya Spencer is going to join us at the African American Heritage Corridor. We're meeting at the Nash House at 5:30 for a tour there. So please join us if you are available. That we're attempting to do sort of our live in-person stuff, so that we have moments where we share and connect that aren't necessarily about putting out a recording.
Mm.
So I hope any and all of you who see this will join us, and others too. And blessings to us all, and thank you all so much for joining us today.
Blessings on your gathering next week. I will be hanging out with Benedictine sisters next week. So excited.
Benedictions to the Benedictine sisters.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Thank
Again,
you
I'm
all.
sorry. I'm really sorry I missed this. It sounds like you had a rollicking discussion. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Good to meet you.